and welcome to the New Antiques 20th Century Furnishings. I'm very pleased to be here in Toronto today, and as I was driving across the border from the US, Boston is where I live, I just wanted to thank you for all of the American flags that I noticed along my route. It just feels really good to know that the Canadians are behind us after the terrible, terrible events that happened just a few days ago. So let me introduce myself. My name is Treena Crochet, and I am the author of Designer's Guide to Furniture Styles. Today we're going to take an objective look at the highly collectible furniture designs of the 20th century and learn how the designers of these pieces blended modernism with daily living. This visual presentation focuses on the ingenuity of specific young designers as they incorporated the newest technological advantages into these furniture designs that we think epitomize 20th century progress. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the social changes that led to new design trends for the 20th century, as well as how the importance of new materials and methods of construction impacted the designs of these 20th century furnishings. And then we'll finish by assessing the value of specific 20th century pieces that's seen at recent auctions and try to identify future collectibles. One other thing that I will do in this presentation is a little bit of compare and contrast, both with prices that are seen at auction for these specific pieces, and then by describing some of the things that were going on in Europe compared to things that were going on in North America. I'm going to start by showing you the work of some designers that you might be familiar with. The desk that's in the upper left-hand portion of the slide is by a French designer who was working in the Art Deco style in the 1920s. Jacques Ruhlmann would not have received this high price during his lifetime, but just take a look at the price that this piece achieved at auction not too long ago, almost $2 million. It's mind-boggling to consider that something from the 20th century is commanding this price at auction, let alone a piece of furniture. One of the things, just to try to put this into perspective, is that Art Deco as a furniture style didn't really have much longevity as some of the other styles that were around at the same time. So that there are fewer pieces of Art Deco furniture in existence. And where I live in Boston, we have the opportunity to visit antique shops full of 18th and 19th century furnishings. But when we compare American furniture even to English or French, the American furniture tends to have a higher value, basically because there weren't as many American pieces made when compared to the supplies that you had in England or in Europe, where you had a lot more in production. So if we consider the Ruhlmann desk that, selling for $1.8 million, we're looking at pieces of furniture that are limited in abundance, and we're also looking at pieces of furniture that at this time of the Art Deco style, most of the fabrication is still handmade rather than machine made. We're also seeing the richness of exotic materials that were being used in the Art Deco style, things like tortoiseshell, ebony, and mother of pearl, and these materials were expensive. So most Art Deco furnishings were privately commissioned pieces specifically designed for a particular interior or home, and taking this into consideration is going to make the piece also more valuable at auction. Basically, it's a one of a kind. Imagine if we compare these prices of furniture to the Van Gogh paintings that sold for exuberant amounts of money in the 1980s. No one expected, even in the 1950s, that a Van Gogh painting would be worth $80 million. So there's a lot of context that goes into how things become collectible and the value that's placed on it. The second item that's on this slide is a lamp, and I'm sure that pretty much everyone in the audience is familiar with the name of Frank Lloyd Wright and the history of his work in the United States. Wright also designed specific items for clients and the interiors that he's designed for the clients, and in the beginning his work was never intended to be mass marketed, the same as the furniture designed in the Art Deco period. So his early pieces also were considered to be one of a kind, and this lamp is a good example. Frank Lloyd Wright had control over most of the work that was produced by his studio in a craftsman, arts and crafts style, and this lamp recently sold for over $500,000. And again, it is in the context of a one-of-a-kind piece. So these examples might not be things that you might find in your attic, or you may not find them at flea markets, but it is something to become aware of as far as what is out there and what you should start thinking about collecting today. By the way, the desk is from the 1920s and the lamp from the early 1900s, as you can see indicated on the slides. So also, we're familiar with the soaring prices of furnishings in the arts and crafts style thanks to Oprah Winfrey's collecting spree. The arts and crafts style dates back to the turn of the 20th century, starting as early as 1895 and continuing in its popularity until about 1910 to 1915. We do see that the arts and crafts designers were between the controversy of what should be handcrafted and what should be machine made, and all of this added to the context of the economic times. We know that the workshops of the Stickley brothers, Gustav Stickley was purporting handcraftedness, but his brothers, who had a factory in upstate New York, felt that there should be some machinery involved. And so what happened is Gustav Stickley kind of broke off and did his own thing, making things that were more handmade, while his brothers continued to use machinery to help fabricate their furnishings. And so which ones are the more collectible today? Well, obviously the handmade ones are fetching a bit more prices, but there are numerous other arts and crafts designers, such as the architectural firm of Green and Green, and those pieces from Green and Green are commanding from $500,000 to over $1 million. So again, we want to look at these pieces in their historical context to try to assess what makes them valuable, what makes them collectible, and what maybe you should advise your clients on when they are looking to buy antiques. Okay, so I did know of a designer in Boston who has a very high-end residential design practice. He was consulting with a new client at her house and found a Tiffany lamp on one of the tables in the house, and he said that, oh, it just doesn't fit into this new idea of what he was planning to do with the house, so he told the clients to just get rid of it. Luckily, there was somebody there that knew the value of the lamp and saved it from being sent to a secondhand store, where I wish I would have been able to find it. Anyway, avoiding these mistakes is a matter of knowing the current antiques market, and this can be easily monitored these days by periodically reviewing several online auction websites. In researching for my furniture book, I was fascinated by the amount of time, quality, and workmanship that went into making a piece of furniture. In the past, architects and designers could design for themselves and not so much for the client, especially when we're dealing with 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. These designers were considered demigods by society, and even more modern example, we're familiar with stories that have been told about Frank Lloyd Wright literally restricting his clients on bringing in any personal possessions into a house that he designed. The Roby House in Chicago is one example. The family were only allowed to bring in family photographs, the kids' toys, their clothing, but they could not bring in any artwork or furniture. Everything in that environment, right down to the tablecloths and rugs, came from Wright's workshops. If I worked with my clients that way today, I'd be starving right now, But it was a period of time in which history where we had a group of architects that were basically making a statement for themselves. Also consider that when Frank Lloyd Wright designed the Roby House in 1909, we still have women that have the big Gibson girl hairdos, long skirts, and your primary means of transportation was still lots of horses and carriages, as there were very few cars on the roads. So putting this very Victorian family into a very modern home would have been almost futuristic. The Swiss designer Le Corbusier went as far as designing the clothes that the lady of the house would wear in one of his designed homes so that she would coordinate with the furnishings. So let's take a look at how modernism starts to infiltrate the 20th century with a changing lifestyle of Europeans and Americans. In many cases, once the whole movement of modernism took hold, you knew you were not living in the past century. And this is because we're very much industrialized. We're looking at a lot of new technology that leads up to the 20th century. And if we reflect on some of those things, just considering the communication at the turn of the century, to have had the telephone service as early as 1876 and expanded railroad service by the late 1800s, we see that the world was rapidly changing, and with that change came a desire to change our environment. Even considering the first airplane, the first automobile, all of these things making the 20th century, in the eyes of history, as the most modern of centuries. Okay, so looking at this house, this is a house that was built in 1938. I think it was actually started in 1936 and finished in 1938. But this was a house for Walter Gropius. Now, in Europe, the Bauhaus, which was in Germany, started in 1919. It was established. It was a school that taught craftsmen, artists and craftsmen, how to make things for machine production. So the focus of study was basically to break away from the past, avoid historicism, and come up with designs that were very fresh, new, and would basically epitomize what this whole idea of the 20th century is all about. So Walter Gropius, like the other teachers and students at the Bauhaus, it was closed in 1933 when the Nazi Party in Germany took over and essentially closed the school, and then a lot of those professors and students came to the United States. Walter Gropius received a teaching position at Harvard University, and I've been a professor for a number of years, so I can just tell you professors don't make a whole lot of money. But when Gropius came to this country, he was given a plot of land in Lincoln, Massachusetts, which is just a suburb of Boston, and he was actually given a little bit of money so that he could build and design this house. So looking at it from the outside, it's very, very modern. It is something that even by today's standards, it's even considered to be very, very modern. But one of the things that Gropius did is he used building materials that were locally sourced. So the house itself is made out of clapboards that have been painted white. I'm going to show you the inside. When we take a look at the inside, this is just the staircase, but you can kind of see a little bit of glass block. You can see this very dark door. The flooring is actually cork. The staircase railing is made out of chrome. Essentially, all of the parts that he used to build this house and do the interior finish out came from industrial catalogs. So the coat rack that you see maybe in the photo is something that came out of a catalog that could have been used in a diner. The cork flooring came out of a catalog. The railings that were used to create the staircase came out of a catalog. So this whole idea of economy and how to build a house very inexpensively is also something that is going to play out in the 20th century, especially after the Second World War. Okay, the furnishings that I'm showing you along with this slide are by Marcel Breuer. So Marcel Breuer started out as a student at the Bauhaus, and he was liked so well, and his designs that he came up with as a student at the Bauhaus, he was then later asked to teach at the Bauhaus, and then he followed Gropius to America, and Marcel Breuer ended up teaching at MIT, which is in Boston. But I'm showing you some of the furniture that Marcel Breuer designed, and if we look at it in conjunction with the interior, the thing that we notice is that since the interior is so modern and almost what we would call industrial looking, you couldn't just bring any traditional furniture and put it in the house, otherwise it would look extremely out of place. Kind of in the same way that Mrs. Roby with her big bouffant hairdo and her long skirts looked out of place inside the Roby house. So the furnishings that develop at this time have to equally kind of stay in line with the architectural developments. Otherwise, things are going to be a bit disjointed. So considering the design of Gropius's house, basically it was designed with a sense of economy. So the economics kind of drove the design direction. When we look at the furniture, specifically this chair by Marcel Breuer, a chair that you see, even being used today. Well, it was designed in 1928. And Marcel Breuer, because he actually came up with the design of this chair while he was a student at the Bauhaus, he was riding his bicycle from the dormitories to the workshops every day, and thought, gosh, this bicycle is sturdy, it's strong, but it is lightweight. How can I use the materials that are in this bicycle, namely tubular steel, and how can I come up with a design for furniture? So this Seska chair, which he named after his daughter, Francesca, is made out of tubular steel, and then the seat in the back is simply a wooden frame, and then there is no upholstery, it's just cane. So when we look at it, there's a couple of things that come to mind. He used very modern materials, the chrome for the tubular steel. He used equipment, machinery, to bend the tubular steel. And then considering the fact that this chair is cantilevered, it doesn't have four legs coming straight down like most chairs designed before this particular chair, it cuts down on the cost because the machine can bend this tubular steel in a way to support the back, to support the seat, and create the legs that actually support the chair. So this was very innovative at the time, and it led Breuer to come up with more designs, and then of course influenced other designers as well, to embrace the machine in order to make the furnishings, and then also experiment with new, what we would consider to be non-traditional materials. Traditional materials being wood, upholstery being made out of horsehair stuffing and fabric or leather. Here we have a whole new approach to what a chair should look like. By the way, Marcel Breuer also lives very near Walter Gropius. Breuer had an architectural practice in the Boston area, as did Gropius. Breuer designed his own house. It's still family owned today, and the interiors of the Breuer house evoke this, again, sense of modernism with everything in it designed by Breuer. Okay, so looking at this Wassily chair, this was also designed in 1928. It's using leather for the upholstery, and it's using the tubular steel, taking away any kind of traditionalism. And he designed this chair for one of his professors, Wassily Kandinsky, while he was a student at the Bauhaus. So I thought it would be interesting to bring it in and show you that the auction price for it just over $30,000. All right, so moving on, Mies van der Rohe, I'm showing you one of his designs in the upper left. This was designed in 1927. Mies van der Rohe, who was the director of the Bauhaus's architectural program, has designed the MR chair, as we can see it in the upper left corner of this slide. It's also cantilevered. It has leather upholstery, a little bit of padding in that upholstery, but here we can see again the idea of the cantilevers and how it's fitting into this machine age industrialism. By contrast, the chair in the lower right-hand corner is a chair designed by Alvar Aalto, who was a Scandinavian designer, and his chair also is based on the cantilever principle, but it is made out of wood. So with Alvar Aalto being Scandinavian and the idea that Scandinavians loved to have the naturalness of woods and the woven textile type fabrics for their upholstery, they were modern in their look, but they still cherished these very natural materials, and so their designs are modern looking, but they still use kind of these traditional materials, okay? But Aalto used machinery to help create these pieces. So the cantilevered arms and the legs, as you can see, one arm swirls and curves and then continues and then becomes the leg, and this is just duplicated on either side. There is machinery that's used to steam press these into molds, and then hand assembly is done to put them together and to do the upholstery. So again, just to try to show you a little bit of compare and contrast. Now, because we know that Europe then suffered greatly through World War II, we don't see many of these items go into production until after World War II. And then I'll finish just looking at, again, designs that came from the Bauhaus. This particular chair here is another Mies van der Rohe chair, very simple, very much, again, modern. We're looking at the industrial materials of the, in this case, it's flattened chromium steel and then cantilevered with this leather upholstery for the seat and the back. So when we look at the quote that I have added here, never encourage copying or imitation of any kind except for the sake of preserving records or great works. This was John Ruskin who said this in 1870. We see by this time period in the 1930s, especially in America, how the designers are no longer looking at the past to be inspired, but embracing the newest technologies and materials of the era. And by the way, this chair is what is called a reproduction. When you are looking to collect furniture, you have to be aware that there are the originals and then there are reproductions. And when you buy a reproduction, it's going to be a lot less expensive than buying an original. And just considering Mies van der Rohe's chairs or Marcel Breuer's chairs, they were first designed in the 1920s, but they didn't go into mass production until after the Second World War. So about 1947 is when they started to go into production. So the year that the chair was made is also going to affect its value. Since this is simply a reproduction, probably sometime in the 1970s, it is not worth as much as a chair that would have been designed in 1930s or late 1920s by comparison. Okay, so we have to then look at cultural changes.
Basically, the first half of the 20th century, the solutions are to utilize technology and mass production and then design furnishings that fit into the context of the architecture for which it was created. But once the war did affect American production, then we see a delay in the development of this kind of modernist style. So what I'm showing you here is an example of then what happens after the war is over. We have a lot of soldiers coming back home. They are veterans. They are able to get money on what is called the GI Bill. And so what we see is a boom of suburbs, the explosion of suburbs, and what we call the track home. So what I'm showing you here is a typical American family in 1948 standing in front of their little traditional Cape house that was built in Levittown, which is Long Island, New York. This isn't just isolated to Levittown, New York. These kinds of communities were being built all across America for economical housing for these young couples that were buying them, moving in, and then starting their families. So here is then also the age of the automobile, because in order to get to these houses in the suburbs, you usually had an automobile that could at least take you to the train station that would then take you into the cities where that's where the jobs were. Okay, so if we look at some of the furnishings, on the left is a chair and ottoman by Eero Saarinen, and on the right is a chair by Charles and Ray Eames, 1946. Ray Eames was the wife of Charles Eames, and she purposely took the name Ray because, as a woman, wasn't being taken seriously in the industry as a furniture designer. So looking at these two examples, we see that these chairs are becoming, again, very modern looking. They are designs that are dependent upon mass production to a certain extent. If we look at the chair on the left, the Saarinen, what is called the grasshopper chair, it is using bent wood for the frame of the lounge chair and the ottoman, in the same way that Alvar Aalto, the Scandinavian, like to keep a connection with natural wood. And then if we look at the chair on the right, the Eames chair, we see a metal base, and then the chair itself is all one piece and it's molded plastic. In the beginning, it started out by being molded fiberglass until then plastics kind of came onto the scene. So we're looking at these designs right at the end of the war. Now, Eero Saarinen and Charles and Ray Eames were designing furniture before the war, but again, because when war broke out, all manufacturing stopped, and then anything that was being made was made for the war effort. Eames and Saarinen won an award at the Museum of Modern Art for their very modern, innovative designs. But unfortunately, again, they weren't able to put these into production until 1947. And just a side note, Herman Miller, which is the big furniture company that's around even today, started to produce these designs for the Eames. And then Saarinen's designs were manufactured by a company called Knoll. Florence Knoll and Hans Knoll were the owners and started up the company of Knoll, Knoll, in order to produce these very modern furnishings. And then typically for the focus of this presentation, I thought it would be interesting to show you, this is one chair. It's the Eames chair that was made in, the very first one was made in 1946. This one dates from 1950, and it just sold at auction for just over $38,000. And what's nice about the photo collection here is it is the chair. It is one of the originals. And looking at the underside of the chair, you can still see the original Herman Miller stamp. I remember sitting in these kinds of chairs when I was a child back in grade school. We had these in our school cafeteria. So thinking again about collectibles and what makes them valuable, it is again, is it original? Does it have any kind of markings that shows its authenticity? In this case, the Herman Miller label. And then once again, is it something from early in the career of this designer, as this chair is, or is it a reproduction? Now, just to let you know, Herman Miller still produces this chair today, but it would have current date. And so therefore, maybe in 20 or 40 years' time, the Herman Miller Eames chair from 2001 might be worth money. But here we can see how much this chair is worth in just basically 40 years' time. So it's incredible. All right, so moving ahead a little bit, getting back to this whole idea of the lifestyle and the type of architecture, and then how are people furnishing these interiors, I thought it would be fun to show you the house that I grew up in. This is a ranch style home. This was built in 1954. My parents built it when my older sister, was first born. But when I was born, this is the house that we lived in until the early 1960s. And how appropriate is it to remind ourselves of how much we enjoyed watching the Dick Van Dyke Show with Rob Petrie and Laura Petrie entertaining in the vastness of their ranch style living room. So we're going to look at a few furnishings that then developed from that era. This one being, again, by the Charles and Ray Eames. It's known as the Lounge Chair 670, designed in 1957. And here we see it as, again, using these molded woods that we saw very much of the Scandinavian influence, and the very cushy leather seat and the back and the ottoman. And the chair actually developed as kind of a reading slash TV watching chair because the late 1950s and all through the early 60s, the whole family unit was centered around the evening TV programs. And speaking of TV programs, you probably recognize this chair because if you're a fan of Frasier, then we know that people have a favorite chair. And when Frasier's father came to live with him, he brought his old recliner that was pieced together with silver duct tape. Yet Frasier had this wonderful, very comfortable Eames lounge chair, but it got relegated up to where the piano was because Frasier's father had to have his very worn but very comfortable recliner. So when we start thinking about the 1960s, one of the things that play a cultural and probably to some extent political, but mostly a cultural shift is the whole idea of when President John F. Kennedy announced the race for the moon. Who could launch the rocket to land a man on the moon? And of course, that came off the heels of the 1957 Sputnik launch of the first satellite into orbit by the Russians, October 1957. So what we start to see in the 1960s, more so towards the later part of the 1960s, is very futuristic designs, almost space age, and the notion that Americans are now on the cutting edge of space and perhaps thinking or dreaming that we may be living in moon colonies someday. So what I'm showing you with this slide, it's called the Case 22 house. Very famous photograph. You might have seen it. It's a house that was built in Los Angeles, and the house is cantilevered over a cliff that sees and takes in the beautiful view of Los Angeles. This is probably considered to be the epitome of ranch-style homes for the 1960s. And then if we look at some of the furniture that's going in it, well, here again, we're seeing Eames, the Eames shell chair. The chair itself is all one molded piece of plastic on these very skinny, very, very thin legs, metal legs. And then we look at Eero Saarinen's tulip chair, designed in 1957, how much it has changed. Here is our first chair that is not cantilevered, doesn't have four legs, not cantilevered, but it's on a pedestal base. And the chair itself is molded plastic on this metal base, and the chair actually swivels. So very space age, very futuristic, and this is what we're going to start to see as we, speaking of TV shows, we are going into shows like I Dream of Jeannie, where the astronaut finds a bottle on the beach after splashdown and a genie pops out of it. And we're seeing the very, very famous cartoon, The Jetsons. So by the end of the 1960s, we are the Jetsons, all right? And we start to see this kind of, again, taking furniture designs into the future and trying to be as um, innovative and futuristic as possible. I can still remember when my father took me and my older sister to see 2001 A Space Odyssey, and how in 2001 A Space Odyssey we were supposed to have regular trips to the moon and telephones where we could actually see each other and all of this stuff. Well, you know, it's 2001 right now, and we haven't really achieved that. But looking at the furniture that was designed from that era, it is again starting to become collectible. Okay, so what I'm showing you here, I'm actually sitting in, this was in a antique store in Chicago that I found 6 Eames chairs, and I could get the whole set for $1,600. That was such a bargain. I can't remember how many years ago this was. It wasn't very many. It might have been probably 1999. So not too long ago. If I had had a car or a means to just schlep them all the way back to Boston, I would have, because that was a bargain. And these chairs, upon inspecting them, one of them still had the Herman Miller label. If we look at the chair on the right, Arnie Jacobson designed the Swan chair. This is a chair also that was designed in the 1950s. I think this was either 57 or 59. But currently, you could get this chair at an antique store for $2,200. So who's to know how much these are going to increase in value as we, move forward in time? Okay. All right. So then coming back to a few other auction prices, well, if we take a look at this kind of montage that I'm showing you here, chair on the left is a very early design when Charles Eames and Errol Saarinen were working on their exhibit for the Museum of Modern Art in New York. This was 1939, and they had an installation for this exhibit, and the exhibit was called Organic Design in Home Furnishings. And this chair is what they designed for that exhibition. So it just recently sold for $129,000. And then the desk on the lower left, another Charles and Ray Eames piece. This was designed in 1951 and went into production by Herman Miller. This sold for $6,900. Then the bookcase that you see, this was very popular in the 60s, the Charles and Ray Eames designed bookcase. This sold for almost $22,000. And then Edward Wormley, who was a contemporary of Eames and Saarinen, this chaise lounge sold for $5,750. And his design is also from the late 40s, early 50s. So how can we project and know what is going to be the collectibles for the future? I just want to interject that every May in New York City, they hold the International Contemporary Furniture Fair. And at that fair, that's where you see the young new designers for today's 21st century, since we're now in the 21st century. And I go every year. When I am teaching a class, I always drag my students along. But here are young, energetic designers. They come from all over the world to show their furniture designs, hoping it gets picked up by one of these big manufacturers. And when I go, because like I said, I go every year, I just am fascinated by how these young designers, they do still look to the past, but they come up with some very unique and innovative designs for our current century. Okay, so that's something to keep in mind. I mean, the Neocon conferences, again, I go to all of those as well, and that's a great way to stay connected to what is new and what is being introduced to the market. But that International Contemporary Furniture Fair is another way to do that. So let's look at some more recent pieces. This one is a Frank Gehry design. Now, Frank Gehry is also an architect, started his career in the 1970s. No one had heard of him in the 1970s. And even in the early 1990s, when I was finishing up my master's thesis, Frank Gehry was just starting to become a name in the architectural community. And of course, now we're seeing that his name is getting more and more and more famous with his very unusual designs. But this is a chair that he designed in the late 70s, and it was part of a collection of furniture that was made entirely out of cardboard. So it's called Easy Edges, and taking cardboard as something that is really a non-traditional material, but it's not really an industrial material either, but it's kind of like a post-consumer waste material. How much cardboard do we use in our boxes that we ship things in? But he came up with a process of gluing layers and layers and layers of cardboard together, and then using machinery, steam pressure to bend it into these shapes. And again, from 1977 just until 2001, this chair is one of the originals, and it's sold for $7,700 at auction. So we just want to try to be ahead of the curve a little bit and try to, again, how do we anticipate what is going to be the next collectible? Okay, we can maybe think about Bauhaus classics. We can think about 2001: A Space Odyssey, very futuristic furniture from the 60s. We could think of 1970s lucite furniture. All of these, as the Bauhaus classics have already proven highly valuable, we can pretty much rest assured that the furniture from the 60s and the 70s, the plastics, even though plastics we know is very bad for our environment, but those are going to be the pieces that are going to really skyrocket as collectibles. So how do these cultural changes link itself to a particular style of furniture? These are some of the examples, okay? And then, as I mentioned before, it's very easy to follow along with what's selling by going to online auction houses and looking to see what are they showing, how much is it, and keep your eye on these emerging markets. So I wanted to end with a designer who has broken all records. He is an Australian designer, Mark Newsom. He started out designing in the 1980s, and I'm showing you a bench in the upper left, and then this chaise lounge that you see in the right, all made out of metal. The chaise lounge, I should say, kind of nicknamed the Lockheed chair because it's like a airliner. It just fetched over almost £1.5 million at auction. So that's $2 million. It breaks the record for an auction price paid for an original piece by a designer that is still alive. So I just want to close by saying researching the furniture book was an amazing experience, and I have learned to respect each designer and what they were trying to achieve for the culture that they were designing for. And it is apparent if you look through my book how I've used architectural setting, the exteriors of buildings, the interior room settings, and specific pieces of furniture, along with some of the accessories, to try to give you a complete picture of these different eras. So we're running out of time to stay in this room, but I'll be happy to remain behind out in the corridor and answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much.